received from Assembly Member Duval.
Okay. Moving on, agenda item 2, declaration of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2? And can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interest and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality, whether relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? None. Agenda item 3, minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Police and Crime Committee held on the 14th of May 2019 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. For agenda item 4, list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous minutes of the committee as listed in the report? So we now move to our main item of business, which is a monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. And I would like to welcome our guests, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime, and Sir Stephen House, Deputy Commissioner, Metropolitan Police Service. Good morning. So we have a set of questions to ask you both. If I start off with the question about the policing of protests, and if I can ask you, Deputy Commissioner, what lessons has the Met learned from the Extinction Rebellion protests, and how will this influence your response to future protests? So just very generally.
Just very briefly, so as you would expect, we run a debriefing session after every major event, and we've done that after Extinction Rebellion. There were a number of things that we learned, many of a relatively low tactical nature. I think we have a very strong view that Extinction Rebellion was the first of its kind in terms of demonstrations. Quite certainly won't be the last of its kind now. So it was something that we hadn't dealt with in terms of the volume and the tactics that were used. And therefore I think it's safe to say, and the Commissioner has already said, I think in this venue last month, that there are learning lessons, and the lessons we will look at next time will be in terms of the number of resources that we deploy straight away. So we will put greater numbers into it quicker, and we will take action against the protesters if they are breaking the law, as we believe they were in Extinction Rebellion. We will take action much quicker than we did this recent occurrence.
Before I come to the policing of today's protest, I mean, some of your colleagues have talked about the laws governing such protests. They need to be reviewed. I mean, what's your thinking?
So
be more specific.
So the two sections that we use the most for public order are Section 12 and Section 14 of the Public Order Act 1986. They've been very fit for purpose up till now. And it's not that they're not applicable, and in fact most of the people arrested were arrested under the Public Order Act. But in terms of the volume of people that we were dealing with, that made it a very, very long and onerous process in terms of getting the arrests in place and then also processing the court files. So we have some views on that, which we will reflect to the Home Office to see if there's any way that it can be, the legislation may be altered or new legislation introduced. But we haven't got any specific requests of the Home Office yet.
And just moving on, I mean, obviously today we've got the United States President here, and can you just tell us a bit about the preparations for how we're going to police today?
Sure, I can tell you a certain amount, but obviously I won't go into any detail. The visit is not even at halfway point yet. Yesterday went very well. The plans worked very effectively. We're very grateful to the public in London, both residents, workers and visitors, for the patience that they showed us in terms of the road closures that were put in place and also the pedestrian movements that were curtailed. I was out walking myself for about 2.5 hours yesterday in uniform around the sites, and the public in general were understanding and very good-humoured, and the cops were very accommodating, I think. I've had a lot of word of mouth back that it went very successfully. In terms of what we do, we follow a tried and tested security regime, which we work on long in advance of the visit, and people saw how effectively it worked last time President Trump was in London, and so far it's worked effectively again. We work closely with his Secret Service detail to make sure that we merge the two security regimes well.
And before I bring colleagues in, obviously these things cost money. The Extinction Rebellion protest, I'm told, the cost of policing was some £7.5 million. How much do you anticipate the policing of the Trump visit will cost the Met?
Well, we're not in a position to estimate that yet, but the last time President Trump visited the UK, it was about cost the Metropolitan Police about 2.9 million. We don't know what the exact figure will be this time, partly because we're not finished yet, and there may be unexpected costs, and also we have some specialist assets which we may have to increase, or we may be able to decrease. I think it's also worth pointing out that President Trump's not the only VIP in London at the moment. We have, obviously, people will be aware the D-Day celebrations coming up, which is part of the reason why the timing of the visit, and there are world leaders from all over the world coming to that. So there are a number of other VIPs. So if some of the costs might be difficult to ascertain because some of our specialist assets will be flexed across a number of people. But once the event's finished, we will total up the cost and let you know.
Right. And understand, in terms of the Extinction Rebellion protest, a special grant application is being made to the Home Office?
That's right.
Right. Presumably, when you sort of calculate the cost of the President Trump's visit.
We will look to recover as much cost as we possibly can, yes. It all fits into London being a global capital city.
Indeed.
And our request of the government that we get 100% funding of the National International Capital City Fund, which at the moment, even by their own admission, is not funded fully. And we would urge in any spending review that the first item of business for policing is that the National International Capital City Fund is fully funded by the government so that the Met Police can do what it's required to do.
And I think you have our support. Can I bring in Assembly Member Arthur?
Yeah. I thought that during the extinction protests, the police made something of a laughing stock in relation to the fact that when people were arrested, they were taken away, don't know where they were put. On the face of it, they weren't put in cells because there weren't any cells, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But after people had been arrested, they were released, and they went straight back again. This is the kind of thing which brings the MPS into disrepute. Given that that tactic was widely advertised, that people were desperate to be arrested and desperate to be photographed and all the rest of it, and then they wanted to be martyrs and rearrested. Did you not think of making any kind of provision for that, i.e. Preventing people from going back and repeating the same offences again?
So, I disagree with much of what you've just said. I don't believe the Met was made a laughing stock. I think much of the world looked at the Met and thought, that's pretty impressive. They've arrested 1,200 people nearly. There's been no violence. As far as I'm aware, we've had no complaints from the people arrested about the way they were treated, which is in direct contrast to how democratic countries, some other democratic countries, deal with protest. I have to remind people, of course, the protest, whilst characterised as peaceful, was extremely disorderly and disruptive and was against the law. The people were lawbreakers.
Deputy Commissioner, I'm not asking about the people who committed the offences. We are the people, we represent the people who pay for policing in London, and I accept that it was peaceful and it went off in a very good-natured way, but in my view, and I suspect, manifestly, I'm initially speaking for myself, and the perception that I had, and the perception that there was, if I can put it this way, in the popular press, was that the police had been made to look asses because they were arresting people, and within moments, pretty much, they came back again. And that kind of thing can't possibly be something that you're pleased about.
The people that you're talking about, and there were a relatively small number
of course they were.
Who actually returned, were, when we identified them, and I believe we identified about 60 of them, were then charged.
Yes.
And we used the force of the law as it exists against them. in answer to the chair's question, I said we hadn't made any specific requests yet of the Home Office. But one of the things you mention is, I think it's important to say, and I know you know this from your experience of dealing with policing, we act within the law and we act within the legislation as it exists. We can't write legislation on the hoof just to suit the tactical situation that we're dealing with. So the penalties for Section 12, Section 14 of the Public Order Act and any obstruction of the highway are relatively low tariff offences. They're dealt with in magistrates' courts, and the ability of the police to control the movements of people is somewhat limited. So if somebody in a democracy wants to protest, is dealt with by the police and then wants to re-protest, it's not always easy to stop that situation coming about. I don't believe it was high numbers. I don't believe that it will become the norm for people. I should probably say that we've already said that we intend to continue with building the cases against all of the people that we took into custody. And as of this morning, 520 letters have gone out to people who were not charged at the time, asking them to come into the police station for an interview.
Yes, well, I'm pleased to hear about that. I'm entirely supportive of people's rights to protest. But in the old days, if I can put it that way, when there would have been cells at every police station, would this have happened? Would they not have been, these characters, being taken to the police station and arrested and possibly have been detained there for some hours whilst appropriate inquiries would be taking place?
Yeah. But no, they couldn't have been, because, I mean, since 1984 under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, you have to deal with people expeditiously. Yes. Therefore, we wouldn't be keeping people in custody for an extended period of time. Can we just go back to the cell issue, because you've mentioned it a couple of times. Yes. There was a lot of discussion in the media and elsewhere about shortage of cells. We actually weren't short of cells.
Really? We
weren't short of cells. What caused problems, and I don't point fingers of blame at this, was simply the fact that the vast majority of the 1,151 people who were arrested opted to use the same two firms of solicitors. Now, whether this was because they'd all been briefed beforehand, if you get arrested, here's a phone number to give to the police, we want these solicitors, I can only speculate on that. It seems unlikely that it was just happenstance. Mm. Well, these firms of solicitors, with the best will in the world, don't have 550-odd lawyers each, so they couldn't all they couldn't cope with the speed and the volume. So that was a problem. And to be frank, we also had a situation where we didn't have time to interview all of the people because there were large volumes. So it wasn't cell capacity that was the pinch point. It was access to solicitors and legal advice, which they're all entitled to have, and also access to interview rooms, because as you know from your experience, most police stations have a couple of interview rooms, 3, 4, and in some cases a few more than that, but not the volume where we could interview hundreds of people at the same time.
Well, thank you, Chairman.
So, Member Pigeon, and then Sean.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because I've heard, there have been reports that Extinction Rebellion are planning protests around Heathrow in July, and that this protest could involve using drones. And obviously we saw the issue with drones closing down Gatwick last year. Do you have the necessary powers and strategy to prevent drone use in these protests if they occur? And
Sorry.
I was going to say, is there a need to change legislation in that area to enable you to deal with this new, I don't sort of call it a threat, but a new tool, if you like?
So I think the legislation exists to deal with. It's pretty clear. I mean, if you walk across St James's Park at the moment, there's a sign up saying no drone zone, and the legislation is there if people breach certain areas. Heathrow is certainly an excluded airspace as far as drones are concerned. So the legislation exists. I would use this opportunity to urge Extinction Rebellion not to deploy drones at Heathrow, not least for the public safety point of view.
Absolutely.
They are extremely dangerous, and particularly in a crowded airspace like Heathrow. So I think to do so would be reckless in the extreme. And would therefore, I think, attract some pretty severe penalties in legislation were they to do so. We've read the reports ourselves, and we are, as they say, looking into the matter.
But you have enough powers, they exist, to be able to deal with if drones were used?
Yeah, that's not to say that more powers won't come along. If it's used more, people may feel that we need more and more legislation. It needs to be more draconian, because it's a real threat to public safety.
Safety, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You talked earlier about how you're changing your tactics for future protests. You mentioned that you'll deploy a higher level of resources more quickly, and you'll take action against people more quickly if the law is broken. Now, when we spoke to the Commissioner about the protests, one thing she said was that essentially as soon as somebody was arrested and taken away, somebody else would take their place. Yeah. Do you think that would be ultimately saving resources to take action more quickly rather than speak to people in the way that was carried out this time?
Yeah, I think, as I said, this is a very new tactic. We wouldn't, and against this tactic specifically, we would deploy officers earlier and we would intervene quicker. What's normally been the case in these situations is that people will come along, they will sit down in an unlawful protest, and they'll do it for a couple of hours. And if we have a view that it's reasonable, it's not causing too much disruption, and we know that they're going to go in due course, then we will, to a degree, allow that protest to take place. We'll give them a time and then we'll start acting. I think when it came to Extinction Rebellion, the reality was it was going on for 10 days. And had we should have taken action earlier, I believe. I don't think we had the resources to take action earlier. The tactic was completely new and unknown to us. And yes, the volume of people who were prepared to come along and sit down and then lock themselves on, etc., and then protect the lock-ons with just numbers of bodies was unprecedented for us. But we do learn lessons from these things. The Commissioner said that last time she was here. We have reviewed it. I've sat down myself with the gold and the silver commander for the day and talked through the lessons that we've learned on that event. And so we will act differently in the future. So
when you said earlier, you sort of meant in terms of days, not minutes. I mean, peaceful protest can still occur in the way that you described for hours. You wouldn't be preventing protests from starting in the same way as might have been implied earlier.
It's important to realise that English law does recognise the rights of people to make the protest, even although under the Public Order Act, if they are an unlawful assembly, then there are parameters on it. We try to facilitate peaceful protest. But when it starts to become hugely disruptive, and it is illegal, which of course Extinction Rebellion we strongly believe was illegal, then we will take action. And if someone comes along to us and says, look, we're going to be here for half an hour, and then we're going to go, then we may well, looking at the asset we've got, the tactics, etc., we may well say, well, actually, that's fine. If you move on in half an hour, then good. If they could turn up and say we're going to be here for 10 days, then there will be a different approach.
Okay, thank you. We heard previously that you've charged 70 people so far. You've just said that you are sending letters to a further 520 people, asking them to come in for further interviews and investigation. It's been reported in the press that the police are intending to charge and proceed against all 1,100 people that have been arrested. So I wanted to ask, is that proportionate? And is there not a considerable extra cost to the police of conducting these interviews, putting witnesses towards court? I mean, is that really proportional to what's gone on here?
So we're not necessarily looking to charge all of the people that we're talking about. We are looking to proceed against them. I think you did say that. It's important that we realise that. Some of the people that were coming in on the 520 letter have not been interviewed yet, and they have a right to be interviewed, and we think that would be best evidence. So we'll give them the opportunity to do so. But if they decline to come in, then we will proceed against them without the interview. Is it proportionate? Well, large parts of London were brought to a standstill. Many thousands, probably tens, hundreds of thousands of people who work and live in London were disrupted in their movements, trying to get to work. The economy lost an awful lot of money. And the concern I think we have going forwards is that people imagine that they can break the law. We believe they did break the law, which is why we arrested them in the first place, with impunity. Now, regardless of the cause, and the Met has to be agnostic on what it is that they're protesting about, if they break the law, there have to be consequences. And I think it's inappropriate for Extinction Rebellion, as we believe that they did, say to their people beforehand, don't worry about getting arrested. The police will be nice to you. You'll be taken to the police station. You'll be released and nothing will happen. You'll not go to court. Don't worry about it. That's not responsible of Extinction Rebellion to do that, because there are consequences when you break the law. And that's what we're seeing now.
Are you concerned there may be the wrong message sent out if people suffer the same consequences for what are peaceful summary offences as they might do for more disruptive offences, such as vandalism, I could see being part of something that might be more serious?
I see where you're going, but that's partly a matter for the courts to decide on punishment and or guilt initially, and then penalty if they find them guilty. What we're doing is applying the law as we think it's the right way to do it.
And will you keep us informed about the ongoing and rising cost of these proceedings?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sylvia Hall, and then I want to move on.
Very, very quickly. First of all, many of us do think it's proportionate, so thank you for that. You are being reactive at the moment, which I understand. You're learning lessons, etc. Have you got any work being done on being proactive? Have you got any officers in a room thinking, right, okay, if we were going to do a demonstration, doing something different, we could do this or we could do that, which would mean that because police officers have got great ideas of their own, and you could think, right, if they did this, we could come in straight away. Are you doing any proactive work? Great, thank you, that's fine. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. So moving on to the next set of questions, which is on violent crime. Can I ask Assemblyman Hall to lead on this?
Yes, okay, thank you. Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, can you briefly update us on the work of the Violent Crime Task Force to date?
I absolutely can. Thank you for the question. Can I sort of broaden it initially to the violent crime situation in London? Because the officers and staff in the Violent Crime Task Force do a great job, but there are thousands of officers out there on a daily basis dealing with violent crime, dealing with the offenders and trying to reduce violent crime. And it's not just the Violent Crime Task Force, although they do a fantastic job. So where we are at the moment, we're seeing, in terms of the headline figures, homicide year on year, so this year compared to the same time last year, is down about 30%. So we're seeing a significantly lower number of homicides this year than last year. We're seeing total knife crime is pretty much flat compared to last year. It's similar sort of numbers. But one of the key measures, and I know you've heard this many times before from us, the key measure we look at is knife injuries for under 25-year-olds, because we believe that's a very good measure of violence on the street, and that so far is down nearly 20% year on year. So we're seeing a significant reduction in that type of crime, and we're getting back to levels that we saw a few years ago. There's still much more to be done on that, and we will continue to operate a number of tactics against people who take knives out onto the street and use knives in violence, because I don't want to give any sort of sign of complacency. There was an attack over the weekend, and sadly there was a victim who died just yesterday from that attack. That was a knife injury attack, and they are still far too common and are a huge percentage of the homicides in London. We believe the tactics that we're using, Violent Crime Task Force and the rest of the organisation, are working. It's a wide range of tactics, not just stop and search, although those numbers continue to be at a high level, and I think will increase further to deal with knives on the street.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned that the use of Section 60 stop and search has increased by 423% in the 18-19 financial year. Can you explain the reasoning behind that, and does it show that stop and search rules actually need to be updated to give you more flexibility?
So I think it's important to stress in those figures, the 423% is an increase in the number of searches under Section 60. It's not the number of Section 60s authorised. So it's an important difference.
Right.
So the number of Section 60s that have been authorised has still gone up. It's gone up 219%. But the number of searches that derive from those authorisations has gone up 423%. So if you look at, so for example, if you look at last year, 17-18, there were 1,836 searches under Section 60, and this year there were 9,599, so many, many more. We have increased the number of authorities. I think we use it far more assertively than we did before, but I think it's an appropriate use. As you know, and we've spoken about here, they are authorised either in anticipation of serious violence or immediately after serious violence. So when our on-call chief officers get a call about a homicide or a violent knife attack, they will always ask, have you considered a Section 60? And sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. So if it's a domestic violence murder, then a Section 60 would almost certainly not be appropriate. But if it's a gang-related situation, then it probably would be appropriate, and we would expect that to be put in place. And it's something which our on-call chief officers pay meticulous attention to. We do question how long they're going to stay in place. We make sure that local communities are aware, that we put it out on Twitter and other social media that Section 60 is in place, and that we tell local partners that they're in place as well.
Yes, I'm aware of them, and I'm actually totally behind that. Do you actually think that stop and search rules need to be updated to give you more flexibility, or are you happy with the ability you have at the moment?
I believe we have what we need at the moment. I think we are seeing, due to an increase in stop and search, a greater awareness amongst people who might be inclined to carry knives that they are likely to be stopped and searched, and therefore I would hope they would leave the knife at home and stop carrying knives. That's the intent behind stop and search.
Yes. Yeah.
So I believe we have what we need at the moment. If that were to change, we would certainly ask.
Okay, thank you. What, if anything, might change about the task force going forward, and how are you actually measuring its success? Have you
The
got
Violent Crime
specifics?
Task Force.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the moment, we see no reason to scale it back or end the Violent Crime Task Force. I think all the while violence is at the level it's at. We need a specific response from a dedicated number of officers. That's what we get from the Violent Crime Task Force. We measure success through the figures that you get regularly, which are the stop and search, the weapons sweeps, the number of knives seized. Again, I would be keen to widen that across the whole of the Met. You know, we're doing 20,000 stop and searches a month, give or take. That's not all the Violent Crime Task Force. There are a number of other assets that carry out those stop and search, as well as borough-based officers.
Yep, good, thank you. Officers from the Roads and Transport Policing Command, well, they were due to stay there till March, at least March. Are they still in place? And if so, are you happy that they'll continue to be there?
So it was extended to September. So they're there until September, and it will be reviewed again before September. What we will do before we get to September is we will talk to Transport for London. We will talk to our Roads and Transport Policing Command to see how they're coping with the abstractions that they've had, and we will make a judgment at that point.
Okay. In January, the Mayor said local policing teams would be given access to additional officers to give focus to tackling drugs and other proactive policing activity. So what additional support have local officers been given, and what kind of proactive policing has taken place?
So most recently, the specialist crime part of the Met has moved into a new structure which is allowing more proactivity on the BCUs. So there's been an increase there. As you know, our numbers are increasing as well in terms of overall numbers of officers. We're now at 30,000, and we're aiming to get to 31,000 by the end of this calendar year. And those officers are being deployed onto boroughs, BCUs. We have the Violent Crime Task Force. We have, this is why I keep stressing it, we also have the task force, which is TSG, Dogs, Mounted Branch, who are constantly deployed through a very sophisticated tasking process, which Deputy Assistant Commissioner Duncan Ball leads on a fortnightly basis, to task officers to the hotspot areas to deal with the upsurge. If there's a temporary upsurge in violent crime in an area, they will go there and target that. So there are a huge number of assets available to BCUs to deploy in addition to their own assets. We've also, because we've moved to 12 BCUs from the 32 boroughs, we have the ability to create proactive teams on BCUs, and every BCU now has a proactive team. So, for example, Westminster, part of the BCU, has a task force dealing with robbery of about 50 officers that have been created in the last month to deal with the robbery problem there.
Okay, and you touched on recruitment there, and that we won't be up to speed until the end of the year. Talking to various police officers, they're all concerned that it's such a young force because we've lost so many of the older heads, if you like, and therefore there isn't the experience there that there should be. What would be your view on that?
So I think we are in a... So I must have spoken to about 50 officers yesterday as I walked round, and we talked about recruiting. It is the nature of policing that when officers join, they are, on average, I think the age is about 24 years of age. We have people who join late as a second career, but in the main it's around 24. And they go, as you know, automatically on to BCU. Therefore, there's always going to be a younger workforce coming into the organisation at BCU level. I think we should be celebrating the fact that the organisation is growing and that we're putting more people through Hendon and more people onto the streets. Of course, it would be great if they arrived on shift fully experienced with the equivalent of 10 years policing experience, but we haven't got a way to inject them with that experience, so we have to put them onto BCU and they develop the experience in a measured way, learning from their peers. As I say, I think we should celebrate the fact that we're growing as an organisation. I have to say, I've been in policing for 37 years. There's always been a view that the workforce is getting younger and new recruits don't know anything. I think that's just the nature of policing, in that we value experience because experience allows you to give a better service to the public. But we have to bring in people into the organisation, and they learn how to police on the streets of London. It's a great place to learn.
I accept that unreservedly. It's the comments that are coming from police officers that have concerned me. If you don't
I don't
manage
know what the alternative is, though. So
well, I was just going to say, is there, if you continue to have this issue and with the churn maybe more than you think, would you consider bringing back people that have left for pension reasons to look at ways you can get older heads? I know, I'm sorry, I know this may...
No, it's fine.
I know that's what's happened to you, but I mean... Wiser heads, not older, wiser head. Do you think that might be a...
Yes, I do. It's a very good point. I should have addressed it. We are actually talking to the Home Office about a number of schemes to either bring people back or retain officers beyond when they reach their pensionable service. As you know, people of my generation join to do 30 years service and then got a pension. It's now 35 years and they get a pension. The nature of it is there is a strong dynamic and financial imperative that once you reach pensionable age, you should leave. It's a big ask for people to stay on, although many people do stay on for the love of the job. If we could make it easier for people to stay on beyond their pensionable service, then that would mean that our experience levels would increase. I think what I have to say, though, is many people, and I mean no disrespect to officers with more than 30 years service, I'm one myself, the idea of officers with 35, 36 years service still working earlys, lates and nights, I'm not sure too many of them would be keen on that. It does take its toll, I think, after a while. But if we could retain the experience in the organisation, perhaps in investigation or on safer neighbourhood teams, that would be a very valuable thing to do. And as I say, we're talking to the Home Office about it.
Just on recruitment, that is one of the discussions I have with Robin Wilkinson around the speed with which you can recruit. Obviously, there's just training, and that is one of the things you have to take into consideration. But the other thing you have to take into consideration is the ability of boroughs and BCUs to be able to train, supervise, mentor new recruits coming in. So that is absolutely part of the difficult arithmetic that it is undertaken in terms of really trying to speed up recruitment, because extra money's come in from the mayor, and making sure that it is a viable proposition, that you do have a lot of new recruits coming through. And of course, I would say this, but the genuine answer to an issue around too many new recruits coming in at one point is to have long-term sustainable funding for the police so that we don't get these ups and downs, because we're not getting the sustainable funding that you need in order to be able to keep up sustainable recruitment and to be able to really make sure that you've got the number of officers that London needs.
Well, my answer to that, as you know, will be you should never let them get below the amount for which you have the money in place for them. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Can I bring in Tony and then Peter?
Yes,
And then on to you, Flo.
this is one for you, Deputy Mayor. The crime dashboard and the way that they have been reporting the increase in violent crime, I've been severely embarrassed of the 10 wards which have had the largest increase in violent crime in London, measured as a percentage, were Chessington North, which is a very quiet sort of place in Kingston, and Canbury Ward, which is a bit busier place in Kingston. But they, by looking at the figures on the crime dashboard, seem to be a sort of centre for violent crime. Now, I know, and you know, and MOPAC knows, that if that was actually interpreted as the number of crimes, the increase month-on-month number of crimes, it's fingers of one hand stuff. But because it does not say that on the crime dashboard, it merely just presents the crude figures, it makes it look as though Kingston is the Wild West, and it absolutely isn't. I wonder if you care to have a look at that, so that there can be some kind of blurb, if you like, some kind of description as to how you should interpret these figures. I have found it rather difficult. You know, some old boy came up to me and said, you know, you've never seen anything happening. And lo and behold, Chessington is this terrible place.
Happy to look at that. I absolutely take your point, that, and that's something that I look at, is the actual figures, not just the percentage increase. Happy to go away and look at how we can make that clearer if it's not clear at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Commissioner, it's just a point of information really I wanted from you. Susan mentioned that in your answer to Susan, you mentioned about mentoring, like younger policemen have mentoring.
Sure.
I just wondered, you know, how official is that mentoring system? How does it work?
Not as official as we would like it to be is the response I would give you. So many BCUs have what we call a street duties unit, whereby officers will be put through formal. All officers are guided, so it happens to every officer. Nobody arrives and then just is thrown into the work without any assistance. They're all guided. They all have tutors of some form or other. Some BCUs are doing it in a very structured way. I think what's important to answer, though, is that when we move to our new recruiting model, which is a national recruiting model, it will be very, very structured, and officers will be very strongly mentored and guided through their first 2 or 3 years in policing. So I think it's a much more professional way to go about it, and we're looking forward to introducing the new system.
When will that come in?
Well, it's due to come in sort of middle of next year, so about a year from now.
Thank you.
Flo.
Morning, Deputy Commissioner.
Morning.
Deputy Mayor. Recently, in the Offensive Weapons Act, which was received royal assent, there included the knife crime prevention orders. Could you give us an update on the pilots?
So you're better informed. I didn't think it had actually.
It 16th of May.
Right,
It's
right.
received royal assent.
I'm sorry, I'm not.
I've discussed that with, I don't think, I've discussed that with the Commissioner in terms of the bill wanting to have pilots, and it's something that we've, you know, it's being developed at the moment. There's no plan, you know, in detail at the moment. It's got to be developed and discussed with the Home Office, and a discussion that we'll have as well.
That's great.
I
That's
do
great.
know if I
From the
can add,
pilots.
sorry, thank you. I could, so speaking to Chief Superintendent Adelakin, although he was quite strongly involved, probably aware in the development of the scheme, and he is developing the thinking around where we will first operate it and how we will measure the success of it, because we want to make sure that we've got very clear results from how we use it. And again, I think it's also important to say we don't see this as a huge volume. This is very specifically targeted, hopefully, at preventing criminalisation of young men.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear, because I think one of the areas in that knife crime prevention order was a subject around criminalising
there's
for
two
up to
parts
2 years
yeah.
for young people as young as 12
Yeah.
if they're found with a knife and
Yeah.
using it on social media.
Yeah.
I think that would send a wrong message in terms of the work we're trying to do to educate young people not to carry knives. So maybe sentencing them for up to 2 years might be a bit disproportionate in the terms of use of force. So it would be really interesting once the pilots are announced how the Met will be using that.
So, I'm sorry, I haven't got a brief on it, and I apologise for that, but my recollection of it from previous meetings here is that there are two distinct strands to it. We want to focus on the preventing criminalisation, but we also feel it's important that there are provisions to deal with young people if they are breaching, if they do breach the order. Otherwise, you know, there is a slight sort of carrot and sticks in it. Slightly blunt way of putting it, but that's how we feel about it.
No, that's fine. One of the other things I wanted to raise with you, Deputy Commissioner, was around the issue of the Met Crime Task Force Twitter account and the posting of very large, in some cases, knives and other weapons.
Yep.
This is an issue that I've raised directly with the Mayor, directly with the Met Commissioner, and in a letter in December 2017, to the Chief Superintendent, Sean Yates. And you may be aware that last Thursday, the Met Task Force Twitter account was, in my view, engaged in some activity which I think should be questioned by the Met in terms of asking its followers if they should continue to post a number of images. And in response to that, you had quite a number of ex-officers and people working within youth groups saying this is counterproductive, and is there any evidence to actually state that posting some of these really large, scary-looking images work? Do you now feel that maybe there should be some guidance on whether this activity going forward should continue? There, you know, my understanding is there's no evidence to say that this actually works.
I think it's a very worthwhile question. I'm not sure of the answer, so there may not be any evidence that it works. Is there evidence that it doesn't work? We've actually discussed this in Management Board relatively recently, and sort of the debate went backwards and forwards. I can completely understand that continual photographs in Twitter and on the Evening Standard, on the news, of horrific-looking knives may serve to frighten people. But I think it also, to put the other side of it, may serve to show people the seriousness of the situation and make them realise what it is that London, and indeed the whole of England and Wales, is dealing with in terms of a knife crime problem, which we can't afford to minimise or sweep under the carpet. And I know you're not suggesting that. I can say that research was done in Scotland when I worked there around this, and the general view was it wasn't always productive to talk in terms of a war on violence, and it wasn't always productive to show violent images, and it was more productive to talk about solving problems, dealing with social issues, etc. I think we have to sort of look at the situation we're in at the moment in London in terms of knife crime and its usage. But I do take on board your point, and I mean, it's interesting that the Violent Crime Task Force has, and we have discussed it in Management Board. We are looking for advice from a number of sources as to, is there a right and a wrong in this? My guess is there isn't a right and a wrong. My guess is that it's actually contextual, and sometimes it is the right thing to show weaponry, and sometimes it's not.
And I think you're right. There is an element of the real human cost of showing what the police are dealing with. Everyone accepts that, but equally, when you have the former director, chief inspector, who I'm sure you know, Graham Golden, stating an 81% reduction in knife crime in Scotland, was due to an approach which didn't involve these images. We do have to question.
Can I just
if-
say that's not right?
Well,
So I was the Chief Constable in Scotland for 3 years, and I was in Strathclyde, the Chief Constable, for 5 years before that. That's not accurate. That's his view.
that's his view.
I don't think it's a definitive view, if I'm honest.
That's fine, but I think it's a case of there are a number of people who've called out the posting of these images online, and when we have, you know, the Met's Task Force Twitter account asking for a show of hands and a poll of who thinks we should post this, I don't think that's the right thing, and that's the right way to engage. If we want the Met to ask people, should there be a forum, should this be discussed with the people who are working in the sector, as opposed to on social media? I'd ask you to take
Okay.
that back
Okay.
to the task force.
So, I thank you for your comment, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think we need to be looking across a wide range of views on this. But equally, we do encourage the use of Twitter. I don't think it's an irresponsible thing to do, personally. I think it's quite a responsible thing. I think I'm pleased they're asking, as opposed to just ploughing ahead. So I would rather celebrate the fact that they're asking. But it's not the only people we should be asking, certainly.
Yeah, but if you could look at the tweets, so it was
Of
last
course.
Thursday, you know, some of the response backs, you know, no need to shout, we just want to get your insight. Everyone's happy with us posting this, correct? I don't think,
Yeah.
just the language being used as well. This is a really serious issue.
I accept that.
Thank you.
Okay.
You finished, Flo.
Yeah, I have, thank you.
Caroline.
Can I just pick up on the
Please, yeah.
announcement Friday as well? The Mayor announced an extra 700,000 expansion of a pilot scheme to track knife crime offenders using tags. Wondering, might be for you, Deputy Mayor, where's this extra investment come from? Why have you decided now to expand this pilot? And have you got any data on how it's worked so far? How many people have been compliant with these tags?
The extra money was in the budget, the Mayor's budget, as part of the additional uplift for policing and crime and tackling violence. It is an extension of the pilot that was announced in February, which was for 4 boroughs, where we thought there'd be about 100 tags because of the pilot. And it is a pilot, a very specific pilot for prisoners released on licence, so it is for those that have already been convicted of knife crime offences. This extra money allows it to be rolled out to 20 other boroughs, and we're expecting that will give us about, you know, depending on sentencing, obviously, about 300 tags, and will give us a very good pool in which to evaluate the efficiency, the effectiveness of it. I haven't got any evaluation yet on the, we have had some tags, but we've not yet looked at, you know, how, it's early days basically, but we'll
So you're
be
rolling
tracking
it
that.
out before you've evaluated the initial pilot?
We are ensuring that there is a wider pool of tags. That's what we're doing. So from 100 to 300 to give us a better pool and a better evaluation of this method of tagging after, you know, on release from prison.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. We just wanted to get clarity on that. I wanted to pick up, start off with you, Deputy Mayor, about the Violence Reduction Unit, and just to understand how MOPAC is ensuring that its work on tackling violence is aligned clearly with the VRU.
So the violence there's a number of ways in which we ensure that the work of the Violence Reduction Unit is aligned, not just to MOPAC, but to the rest of the GLA. We have regular meetings with LIPEC, not just as myself as Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, but also with Debbie Weeks-Bernard and Joanne McCartney, to make sure that there is an absolute understanding of what the Violence Reduction Unit is doing, the work programme that's been set out, but also to ensure that the work that each of our areas are doing is aligned. And we all sit on the partnership reference group that the Mayor chairs, which meets regularly. I think its next meeting's at the towards the end of July. So that work programme that has been put forward and the objectives that have been put forward by LIPEC have been developed in consultation with us. But obviously the Violence Reduction Unit is, you know, it is a partnership unit. It's not just, you know, what do I want for as Deputy Mayor of Policing and Crime, or what does Joanne McCartney or Debbie Weeks-Bernard want. But we are very, very clear that not just it should be aligned, but there should not be duplication, and that is part of the work that we do by meeting regularly to ensure that that happens.
The partnership reference group that the Mayor chairs,
Yeah.
are the papers publicly available for that?
Yeah, they're on the website.
They're on the website, great. Okay, so we can make sure we properly look at those. And I understand, and we had LibPEC before us in April, and looking through, I think, some of the paperwork, there's lots of deliverables, end of May, end of June. Is the VRU on track to produce things like its work programme, its performance framework, the commissioning framework?
It is on track. It has already, at the last Partnership Reference Group, LIB presented the outline of the work programme, and then it is, the detail of that has been put in place. And as far as I know, it is on track in terms of commissioning programme. It has already sent out, procured, and it is now in train the review of the homicides and serious cases in London, and that, as far as I know, it is on track. So yes, it is working up and running.
And in terms of its work programme, because I think when LIB came before us, the conversation kept always coming back, in some ways as our focus has this morning, to young people and knife crime. But actually violence is far wider than that. We've got domestic violence, 2,000 domestic abuse violence incidents with injury per month in the capital. Actually, it's not just young people, it's older people. If you're in your 40s, I think you were 3 times more likely to be killed by a knife in London in 2018 than you were in 2017, though relatively the numbers are small. How are you making sure this unit is properly focused on all elements of violence, not just gang, youth crime, knife crime?
You're right about the importance. I totally agree with you in terms of the importance of ensuring that the scope is wider than the just youth crime, and that has been really clear from the beginning with the violence reduction unit that it takes in domestic violence and sexual violence as well. The objectives that LibPEC has set out does include working with families and young people and making sure that they are there, that there is support going into there will be support going into the home where there is domestic violence. So that is part of the objectives, but part of the prioritisation that LIB and the Partnership Reference Group has done is to make sure that at the beginning, although this is a long-term plan, there is a focus on young people, because we're taking that real public health approach that actually, if you really do the early intervention to prevention, you will be intervening on domestic violence and you'll be intervening on sexual violence as well, and that will mean that in the long term, those young people will be less likely to be perpetrating violence, because we all know when you look at what are the drivers of the crime, adverse childhood experiences, which includes domestic violence.
Lovely, thank you. Could I come to you, Deputy Commissioner? Obviously, you worked in Scotland. You will know probably better than anyone about how the public health approach has worked there. But previously, concerns have been expressed that London is just so different. How effective do you think the model for London as it is stands? Are there other things we should be looking at doing in the capital?
No, I think the model is the right model. I think so long as it's contextualised for London. What isn't right is, well, what worked in Glasgow will work in London, it won't. What works in London won't work in Glasgow. They're very different places with very different problems. Different, for example, Glasgow has one council with one partner.
Yeah.
London has the mayor, but it has 32 councils. That makes it ultimately far more complex. It's just one example of where it's different. But the model is the right model. I mean, I couldn't agree more with what was said just then about, if you could stop the world for a minute and say, right, where do you want to put all your money? You would put all the money into the younger generations and say, we can stop this now because we can plough money into youngsters, we can reduce adverse experiences, we can improve their anger management, we can make them understand the consequences of their actions far more, and it will pay dividends going forward. The reality is, Violence Reduction Unit hasn't got that luxury, and neither does the Metropolitan Police Service. We have to deal with the world that we're in. But there's no doubt that an emphasis, I think, on younger generations and moving forward is the right way to do it. And it is all linked up. Domestic abuse leads to angry people, disturbed people. That results in violence on the streets. It results in broken families. It results in poor parenting, etc., and it all feeds into a major problem for us. I think the approach is right. The difficulty is, and somebody said it, how do you make sure you focus on all these issues? Well, that's the problem, isn't it? You can't focus on everything. Focus means you look at some, not all, and that's an issue.
And how is the Met collaborating with the VRU? What are your links there?
So we meet on a very regular basis at various levels within the organisation. We're very keen to help inform the VRU and frankly influence them in terms of what we think would be most effective for them to do. So sort of issues we're looking at are how do we improve our ability in the police to access mental health and drugs issues, so that we can point offenders and victims in the right direction as quickly as possible. How do we work together to make sure that we are dealing with the more serious and urgent cases quickly? So there's a significant join up. It will grow, I think, join up. I mean, VRU's in an early stage at the moment, and as it starts to move forward with its programs, we will be able to work more closely with them. But I'm positive about the future for it.
Great, thank you. To both of you, how beneficial do you think it is that the VRU has changed how it was originally going to work? So it was going to have this pan-London approach with, I think, about 5 hubs where boroughs were together, so the whole of London would be covered. And now it's focusing on very specific areas of London. Is that the right approach?
So what you're referring to is some of the early papers that went to the partnership reference groups, which were early, before LIB arrived, right. And we were very clear from the outset that these were early workings of how the Violence Reduction Unit could possibly work. LIB, quite rightly, has come in and, as Director of the Violence Reduction Unit, has looked at that. It's not a change from a pan-London approach. It is a change from having, specific hubs, 5 or 6 specific hubs out there in London, it is to make sure that there is a much more, the way that Lib would describe it, a much more hyper-local approach where, although Tony was pointing at percentage increases in particular wards, it does illustrate the point that actually, even in the high crime boroughs, some of the places where the violence is taking place is very, very hyper-local, and it's within individual wards, sometimes within individual very specific areas. So that is the change that has happened. It doesn't mean there isn't a pan-London approach, because one of the other things that the Violence Reduction Unit has been set up to do, and why it's so important that we have the buy-in from the partners who are also very, very important, such as the NHS and the Metropolitan Police, is that it is taking strategic issues which need to be tackled pan-London, and making sure that is, where there are barriers locally, lifting them up and tackling them strategically. We have very, very good buy-in from the NHS, for example. They are appointing somebody to be the main person for tackling violence within NHS London. There still is a pan-London approach, but the focus is really making sure that there is a hyper-local response to ensuring that there is the best of good evidence, best practice, and that there is that delivery locally.
Okay, do you have anything to add on
I don't really
that?
think I
Okay.
can add to that.
And then, finally for me, just the amount of money this unit's got a big task, and it's got relatively, I think, Lib described it as a decent sum of money, 5 million, really. It's quite a drop in the ocean with the task in hand. Are you looking that you're going to look to increase resources to make sure it does have impact across the whole of London?
So if that were the only money that was being spent on tackling violence, I would agree with you. It would seem not enough, but that £5 million is specifically for the commissioning and specifically for the work of the Violence Reduction Unit, and it is on top of the work that MOPAC does, the London Crime Prevention Fund, a lot of money going into tackling violence there, and Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. The Mayor put £15 million into extra additional services, and then of course, because it is a partnership unit, there are across the GLA there's the £45 million for the Young Londoners Fund, which is very much a key element, a vital element of that long-term preventative strategy of making sure young people are given the best opportunity and the best chance not to go down that route of violence and not to go down that route of criminality, because they have other things that they can be doing. They are being given skills, and they are, being kept occupied at the bottom line, really. And then, of course, there is the sort of the might of other partners, such as local authorities and the NHS. So that it's £6.8 million for the Violence Reduction Unit. Some of that is a very small core staff, and the £5 million is on top of and additional to a lot of investment. And we are lobbying very hard the government to ensure that they match us in terms of the Violence Reduction Unit money. The government announced £100 million of funding for tackling violence a couple of months ago, I think £65 million of that has now been finally allocated. £35 million is still got to be allocated, and that is from the government has been talking about to go into violence reduction units, and we really are lobbying hard that London receives its fair share of that as well.
Okay, but it's making sure the BRU has oversight and links up with all those other funds, which is going to be the crucial thing there. And then I think we wrote to the Mayor in December setting out our suggestions for shaping the work of the VRU. Are there any specific recommendations in that you would like to see taken forward by the VRU?
I'm sorry, I haven't got that in front of me, and from memory, when the committee wrote, I don't think there was anything in there that we disagreed with or was not part of the work plan. You'd have to remind me. I'm sorry, I don't have them in front of me.
Yeah, I don't think I have them in front of me either, but perhaps we can
I'll
just...
take a
I don't
look.
know if we've had a
I'll take
formal
another
response even on... No?
You
Yes?
will have had you should have had you have had a response.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's just we want to just
I'll
make
check
sure
with-
those are picked up. And I saw that consultation of the work programme by the end of May. So I presume that our letter will have fed in as our thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that
Good.
consultation on the work programme was very intense consultation, and part of that came with a different way of delivering it that we've just discussed, and went to the partnership reference group in it would have been, where are we, June? Yeah, it would have been in May. So absolutely, it was on. That was part of the partnership reference group
Great,
agenda.
just to make sure our thoughts are picked up. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Karen. So moving on to the topic of hate crime, and can I ask Assembly Member Barry to lead on this?
Great, thank you, Chair. We had a meeting in May where we heard evidence from a number of groups working on hate crime, supporting victims and liaising with the police in many cases. So I've got a number of questions that come out of that as part of our investigation. The first question is about sanction detection rates. We heard this varies from 4 to 14%. For 4%, you're looking at crimes like transgender and disability hate crimes. The 14%, the higher sanction detection rate, is for racial and religiously motivated attacks and crimes. So can I ask, how do you feel about this sanction detection rate, Sir Stephen, and how does it compare to other forces around the country?
I don't think any of the sanction detection rates are where we want them to be. I don't regularly compare with all other forces, but in comparison with some of the similar forces to us, so West Mids and Greater Manchester and the bigger forces, I don't think we are an outlier particularly. These are crimes that we are finding difficult around the sanction detection rate. So as I say, I don't think that the figures are acceptable, and we are working to try and increase our detection performance.
What are the catches here in terms of detection? Surely London has more, for example, CCTV coverage than most other cities. The attacks that take place on public transport must be detectable.
There's a variety of attrition factors in relation to the detection of hate crime. As you get with any crime, delays can mean that victims lose confidence, which is common with domestic abuse. If it takes a long time, they think the police aren't taking it seriously, and they move on with their lives. And sometimes our investigations do take a long time. Sometimes we simply do struggle to get the evidence that we need to proceed with a prosecution. I don't think it's lack of appreciation of the seriousness of hate crime. I think the Met's made huge strides in the last few years in relation to its officers' understanding of the various categorisations of hate crime. I would go as far as to say, from my experiences around the UK, the Met takes it, London takes it as seriously, if not more seriously, than many other parts of the UK. I think it's a difficult crime. They are a series of difficult crimes to deal with.
So one thing that came up in terms of, you mentioned the time taken and people dropping out because they lose confidence in the investigation. One thing that the Met has is hate crime liaison officers, and they used to be one per borough, and now effectively these are done at the BCU level, so there are fewer of them, although some BCUs are putting in liaison officers for each borough. How do you think that this is affecting things, and can anything be done to reprioritise those officers?
I think there's always an understandable concern amongst partners and communities when they see titles change and restructuring. I genuinely believe that moving from 32 boroughs to 12 BCUs gives us greater firepower. If you combine that with the fact that we are increasing in numbers, then I think it does present a better model for delivering a service to the public and to the victims specifically. I think part of the difficulty, and we do need to look how we overcome this, is moving to the 12 safeguarding hubs within the BCUs is less clear for outside observers to see, well, what are you actually dealing with? Because as you know, we're moving to a multidisciplinary approach where the officers working in the hubs across London will deal with a variety of safeguarding issues, as denoted by the name, so that they will become multi-skilled and multidisciplinary. And we've done that partly because there is such a crossover in so many of these crime types. It's made sense to do that because actually investigating it simply by crime type is quite limiting and quite structurally divisive, really. So it's better to join it up and deal with the victim as a whole and try to safeguard as a whole. So I actually think we'll bring more resources and more flexibility and more expertise to the problem with the new model than we did under the old model.
Okay, we'll probably ask some further questions about that, I would imagine, in writing, because I think we had some evidence from the groups who liaise with the liaison officers that they were not feeling that this was, and that the potentially local knowledge was being lost. So
okay,
maybe there is more liaison that can take place.
I think we'll be able to. I think over time we'll be able to give that confidence to people that we are taking it seriously, that there are more assets. I think this is a problem with restructuring. It does drive some dislocation with partners, and often that is more difficult to overcome with voluntary partners and groups than it is with, say, local councils. So we need to work at that. I accept that. But I know BCU commanders are doing that at a local level.
Okay, thank you. One of the issues that was raised at the meeting was about the Disability Hate Crime Matters programme, because there was quite a clear increase in reporting and sort of work being done on disability hate crime while this existed, and then it dropped again afterwards. So that's rose into 2016 and then went down again. Can I ask why the Disability Hate Crime Matters programme was stopped? Because that seems to have been quite effective.
I think, again, it's a valid question. I think it was a pilot to look at the situation. I think we learned some lessons from the pilot, so as a result of it, we've got all call handlers are currently going through training, which should finish in September this year. So 1,700 call handlers in our 3 centres are receiving enhanced hate crime training, and we are currently developing a hate crime training package to deliver to all frontline staff, and that will start in the next 2 months. So that's going to go out to thousands of officers across the Met. We learned that from the pilot that we weren't good at identifying the vulnerabilities when people get in touch with us in the first instance, and we have to ask more questions. We have to be more victim focused in relation to that's what the training is about. And we've also realised that our responding officers don't always recognise when they see, so we're now enhancing their training so that they will have, well, they already have, but the training will be enhanced. But as you know, the hate crime policy includes a number of mandatory actions around investigations, which includes a checklist for all frontline officers to go through to make sure they're asking the right questions. The supervisors also have a guide to what they should be asking in relation to the situation, and there are regular follow-ups in terms of the supervisory requirement to check up on how the investigation is going. So there's quite a lot. I know Wahid Khan was here talking to you, and he went through some of this in detail. That training is underway for Met CC and will start soon for Frontline. We believe that will increase the reporting rate across the whole of London again.
Okay, and what you said just now in terms of the training, that's for all hate crimes in general, because what we heard was essentially that disability hate crime was a bit different, and that people who were victims of it were the least likely to be aware that they were the victims, and therefore the police training role was very important.
Yes, well, exactly my point. So some of the checklist is to make sure that the officers are actually asking questions to identify there are problems, even if the victim doesn't realise or hasn't consciously realised that they are a victim of disability hate crime. The checklist will flag that up to the officer.
And that's specific to disability hate crime. Okay.
Sorry, the training isn't specific to it, but within the training, that's what the checklists are designed to do.
Yeah, there are checklist items specific to disabilities. Okay, that's useful to know. Thank you. The Catch Consortium we also talked about at the meeting, and it seems like they have had not exactly a cut in budget, but they've had the same budget that's now expected to cover a much wider area, i.e. everyone across London, as opposed to the 2 original pilot boroughs. What are your future plans for that? Are you planning to boost its resources?
I don't think that's us.
It's a MOPAC.
It's a MOPAC.
So, Sophie, the same question to you.
That's okay. You're right, it's gone pan-London. There was a pilot and now it's gone pan-London. They've been contracted to do that till March 2020. We'll be looking, our procurement rules means that we will then have to put it out to tender because we can't carry on just extending. And we'll probably start reviewing that quite soon about how we can make sure that we get it out to tender and make sure there isn't a gap in services. We are aware that they've gone from a pilot of 2 boroughs to pan-London. It's good. It means that people that, not just in those 2 boroughs can access them, but there's clearly an issue about capacity, and that's part of the review that we'll be undertaking.
Okay, when will we know the results?
Well, we've got to repprocure. I think we've got to repprocure and get that in place by March 2020. So.
Okay, we'll follow up on that. I just want one supplementary question, if that's okay, and it's to both of you. Obviously, we talked at the meeting about other factors that are prejudices, which are not currently covered by the hate crime legislation. There's a list of 9 things in the Equality Act, which are things that you can be discriminated against about. Only 5 of those, I think, are in the hate crime legislation. And there are other issues as well. So one thing that was talked about was the intersectionality of attacks on Muslim women. 58% of victims of anti-Muslim hate crime are women, and it seems like sexism is a major factor, an aggravating factor on top of the religious prejudice against these women. Another thing I've been looking at is the number of attacks on homeless people. Homeless people are very often victims of crime, and it seems like in some of those cases, prejudice against that person as a homeless person is part of the issue. Now, the Law Commission has been asked and is doing a review of hate crime legislation. It's looking at factors such as age and subcultures such as goths who've been victims of clearly what is hate crime as well. But issues such as the homelessness, which is obviously a very London issue, and the intersectionality, the sexism, the misogynistic aspect of a lot of hate crime doesn't particularly seem to be included within their terms of reference. So I want to ask both of you, are you compiling evidence and a response to the Law Commission review? It's due to launch the end of this year, the beginning of next year. And will you be looking at factors that maybe London has greater insight into, like these issues I've mentioned?
So I'm not aware at the moment whether or not we are working on a response. I'd be surprised if we're not asked to respond. And if we're asked to respond, we certainly would respond. Yeah. But I'm sorry, I don't know if we are.
I mean, the Law Commission's asking for people to respond in general, so I don't think
the Law Commission, I asked this question as in preparation for this PCC. I don't think the Law Commission has yet asked for a call for evidence. If they do ask for a call for evidence, we'll obviously have to look at what
it's not out yet, but they flagged that they will.
They haven't yet asked for that. But in terms of, the Law Commission, I think in 2014, talked, very similar review, looked about disability hate crime. EHRC's talked about a disability hate crime, disability, transgender and sexual orientation not being covered by the legal protections that you're talking about. I would agree. It does seem like it needs equal protection in the way that it's dealt with. We'll have to see what comes out of the Law Commission review. But in terms of misogyny, there, as you know, we've discussed this here before. The Nottinghamshire have done did have a treating misogyny as a hate crime. It has had mixed, the evaluation of that is mixed, and it's gone back to be looked at again. We're waiting to see for whether that has made a significant impact on the way that women are dealt with as victims. For me, that's the really crucial bit. And I would like to, what I would be evaluating is, does it make an additional impact on top of the work that we are doing and the Metropolitan Police are doing in terms of its strategy, our strategy and its strategy in tackling violence against women and girls? Because that is the crucial bit about how does the support for victims, of the women who are victims of harassment, how is that going to improve? I think our violence against women and girls strategy is really strong on that at the moment.
Okay, so we'll keep each other informed about responses to the review, and hopefully the committee can also feed some information as well.
Fine. Moving on to the next set of questions, which is around antisocial behaviour. And if I'll ask you, Steve, to lead.
Thank you very much. I've moved on to my question really quickly, which shows obviously the improvement in chairmanship. Good morning both, Sir Steve and Sophie. I'd like to turn the debate to antisocial behaviour. The outgoing Victims Commissioner recently published a report, and I have to agree with the sentiments around antisocial behaviour is often downplayed, but it causes misery, anxiety, victims feel unsafe, and it can lead to activity around prostitution, begging, drugs, etc., etc. It has always been with us and will always be with us. And I think whilst violent crime clearly is the #1 priority in London, it's important that antisocial behaviour stays on the radar. The committee published a report beginning of last year around that with recommendations, and I wanted to touch upon that. So initially to yourself, Deputy Mayor, one of the issues around it is to action, you have to gather information and gather data. And one of the issues around antisocial behaviour is whilst the Met may be gathering its data around 101 calls, and we'll get to that at the moment, there are local authorities and housing associations and others who are also being contacted around antisocial behaviour. And this was picked out by our report, so that the issue is the true level of antisocial behaviour being measured? And actually to you, Deputy Mayor, will MOPAC amend the way it collects ASB data in light of what I've just said?
So I've written to you on this before, and our position hasn't changed on this. We don't have any plans at the moment to change the way that we monitor the data. We use the reporting from the Metropolitan Police on antisocial behaviour, and our plans are to continue to do so. One of the reasons behind that is that the way that data is gathered through housing associations, housing providers and local authorities is very different in each of the 32 boroughs, and I think I don't know how many housing providers there are in London. There will, I'm sure, be up to the hundreds of housing providers. So for us, the most consistent way of monitoring the data is through the Met reporting, and that's what we plan to continue doing at the moment.
But, well, surely by that admission, you are missing a whole swathe of data around antisocial behaviour on our estates that are maybe housing association estates or council estates that the Met aren't directly involved in, because those really excellent teams from the councils may be dealing with that antisocial behaviour. And as a result, the Mayor and yourself, and probably by sharing information with the Met, won't have a true picture.
But I think we've got to be, in terms of just should say from the outset, and tackling antisocial behaviour has been one of the things that I've focused on for many, many years. I worked on the Antisocial Behaviour Act, which brought in some really good powers in 2003 to ensure that you could close crack houses, and there were proper protection orders and the like. And I continued to do that when I was at Hackney. But you will know, and I know, that antisocial behaviour is not just a police matter. When you look at the antisocial behaviour that people are concerned about and are reporting, it is around, yes, it is around drug dealing, and some of it is around criminal acts that then become a matter for the Metropolitan Police. But it is also, if you're a housing provider, a lot of the antisocial behaviour that has been reported is, for example, when people are living below tenants who have taken the carpets up, and there is very really disturbing, really significant impact on people's lives, but very loud footsteps or children running around. I don't think that's a matter for the Metropolitan Police, and that is obviously my scope as Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. So we've got to be really clear, what are the parameters that MOPAC has, what is the scope that MOPAC rightly has influence over and remit over, and antisocial behaviour is very wide, and my plans and my focus at the moment is on that which the Metropolitan Police has scope and a remit over, and that is why we continue to look at it through the crime reporting.
Okay, I mean, you're reflecting that it doesn't necessarily reach the bar of breaking the law, hence it will not come to the Met. I will be talking to Steve a little bit later about the role of the local ward teams on that subject, but I'll get back a little bit later. I'll get back to you, Deputy Mayor, if I may. In our report and our work, we found support for Pan-London Antisocial Behaviour Board, and we wrote about that in our recommendations. Have there been any discussions with London councils about re-establishing it, as highlighted by the Mayor in last year?
We have had discussions with London councils around that. They haven't got very far, I have to admit, in terms of it being we believe that responsibility is more for London councils. We've had that discussion. There hasn't been much progress around that.
But you'll be looking at a continuing conversation.
We'll continue to look at it, yeah.
Okay. So Steve, I'll pick up on that last point I touched upon, because to me very much the ward teams, particularly the PCSOs, where there are those in the teams, have an important role to play on the ground regarding antisocial behaviour of any level, really. Would you, bearing in mind the Deputy Mayor's comments, are your ward teams working closely with councils and housing associations around ASB?
I would say if they're not, we'd be very disappointed. I mean, that's part of the primary reason why they're there and how they work. It's a partnership effort. It's a problem-solving effort. They had training in both of those disciplines, and that's what we expect them to do. So yeah, and they would be the first port of call. So yeah,
good, reassuring. And if the ward panels were setting the priorities, or P, whatever the language they care to use at any given time, around antisocial behaviour, would you expect those teams and the skippers of those teams to go away and work on that as a priority in their wards?
So I would expect them to be reflecting what the BCU says are local priorities. If it's antisocial behaviour and there's a join-up, that would be great. I think they have to pay attention to the organisation's views, but they also have to pay attention to partners' views. So it's a difficult one, isn't it? You can't have too many priorities, back to the earlier point. But if there is a convergence, then that should be their priority, yeah.
Okay, I'll just put a sort of marker there, is that I think it's important that ward panels are encouraged and supported by their officers, which in the main they often are. Yeah. And if those, then the whole point of those ward panels is to talk to their officers about setting. I know officers don't like the language of setting priorities, but to have conversations around local issues, it would be important that those officers and sergeants take away that with some.
I agree entirely. Yeah.
Because sometimes that doesn't happen. Right, here we go. What's next? We're pleased that you accepted our recommendation, it's always a good thing, about antisocial behaviour warning notice schemes being assessed in Tower Hamlets.
Yes.
How's that going? What sort of progress have you seen around that, and are you going to expand that perhaps?
So we are very happy with the way that worked. The figures I have show that of all those who receive warnings, only 8% re-offended. I think that's pretty good return rate, and if we could replicate that across the whole of the capital, that would be good news. And there are plans to expand it. I think we're currently now trying out in Central North BCU as well, and if it's successful, I expect it would be something we'd move around the whole of London. Yeah.
It's a kind of, for many thousands of public listeners, it's a kind of warning letter prior to an ASBO. So, you know, we know you're doing something that's upsetting, doing these things. Yeah. Stop it, otherwise you'll get
it's like an acceptable behaviour contract.
Yes.
And I think that it just shows that for the vast majority of people, a very early intervention at a very low level actually has an effect.
Yeah, exactly. That's good. Now, the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, outgoing and perhaps the new one, has criticised the way ASB victims are supported in quite a strong manner. That's been reflected in the recommendations of our reports. Another way, the language was quite strong language, that they were seen perhaps almost as a second-class citizens in the victims' hierarchy. Are you both, for your different offices, reflecting on those thoughts of the Commissioner?
I mean, I agree with Baroness Newlove's report in terms of focusing on the impact that antisocial behaviour can have on people is incredibly important. And she's had a very quick win, hasn't she? She raised the issue of charging for 101, and the government have now come out and said that from April 2020 that will be a free service. Really, really welcome that, as long as that doesn't impact on our budgets as well. But in terms of victims of antisocial behaviour, you'll know that the money that we get from the government, from the Ministry of Justice for victims is very clearly, there's a very clear scope to it, and antisocial behaviour victims, those people who are victims of antisocial behaviour are not able to be, we can't commission services for them from that money. I would welcome the government widening the scope and increasing the investment so that we can commission services for victims of antisocial behaviour, because I know that it really does have an impact on people's lives and well-being.
And that report and recommendations that's informing the work of your Victims Commission of our building.
Absolutely. I mean, not all of it is around, not all of it is within our remit because there's recommendations about actually those that are providing services to victims, and we're not direct service providers. We obviously commission it, but those that we are interested, are pertinent to us. We are looking at.
Okay.
So.
And thank you. And lastly, for me, going back to you, Steve, is around 101 service, which is something we've discussed here at some length over a period of time, and the issue about drop calls. And I think antisocial behaviour might be a particular crime or victim line that people may be more tempted not to persevere for 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes because they're bothered about it. Yeah. Now, can you give us an update on the 101 service? Because there is a narrative, an argument that when the service was in not such a good state, the ASB, it could have reflected in the ASB figures.
Sure.
So, in other words, drop calls, so less reporting, so we can all say there's less ASB. Do you want to reflect on that potential debate at all?
Well, I think there's a logic to that argument. People might feel that, well, maybe it's not that important if they hang on a long time. But the figures I have, I think, are very encouraging around our call answering. So I know you're not asking about 999, but in January this year, we answered emergency 999 calls in an average of 5.8 seconds, and 101s with an average of 30 seconds. Now, 30 seconds is a long time to hang on, but if you look around the country, 30 seconds is an extremely strong performance on 101. And I actually don't think it would put too many people off. So I think that's not a bad performance. We are continuing to recruit people into our call centres, and I would hope to see the figure improve further. But I don't think it's a too bad a figure.
Well, 30 seconds clearly isn't, but it's when we've had examples in the past now work when it's 4, 5, 6 minutes, which is.
I mean, that is an average, and there will still be at peak periods outliers, but there'll also be, quiet periods where it's even quicker than that. The average is 30 seconds. I think that's pretty good. It's a lot better than it was.
Okay, thanks. No doubt the committee will continue to look at that. Thank you, Chair.
I just said one, Deputy Mayor. You mentioned that you're not going to change the way that you collect figures or the figures that you use. So going back to Steve's original point, that they come entirely from the Met, is that right? So that would not include the British Transport Police, say?
No, they're not. It's not the British Transport Police, it's the Metropolitan Police one. Figures on our dashboard.
Isn't there just maybe a case in the future looking at including, I mean, I can understand in a way not going to local authorities and housing, or rather I understand your reasoning for not. Yeah. But with the police, transport police, so much antisocial behaviour happens on public transport, you see.
I'm really happy to talk to British Transport Police in the City of London around what they regularly report on, and to see if that gives us a better picture of the antisocial behaviour in London, and to discuss that with TfL.
Could be worth doing, actually.
Yeah,
I think where a lot of people experience it is actually on public transport.
Yeah. No, happy to look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so coming to the last set of questions, and we will definitely finish by 12 for you to go, Sir House. The last set of questions is on independent custody visitors. Andrew.
Thank you, and as you know, Sophie, I've written to you about this as well. But can I start off by asking how many visitors MOPAC currently has on its books, and is that enough to provide cover for all the custody suites?
We have around 230 volunteers at the moment, and it does cover all our custody suites.
And how often does MOPAC require visits to be made?
The visits, we I don't know, sorry, I don't know if we require have a baseline for the number of visits, but we certainly keep an eye on the number of visits through regular quarterly reporting for the independent custody visitors, and we are meeting our requirements in the number of custody visitors and the number of visits that are taking place.
So, looking at your outturn then, how many visits are taking place?
The number of visits in London, there were 1,215 visits made to custody suites across London in 2018.
Have you got that broken down by custody suite?
I haven't got that in front of me, but I'm sure we can give that to you.
If we could have that, it would be helpful. See, and one of the concerns I have, as you know, is the delay in
vetting.
In vetting.
Yeah.
And the constituent I wrote you about has been a visitor for 11 years. She applied to renew her pass in March last year. Nothing happened. I wrote you about it. You've obviously looked into it because she's now been told that the submission she put in June 2018 to get vetted has now expired, and she's been asked to do it all over again. So here we are, well over a year on, and somebody still hasn't had their vetting completed. So perhaps we could ask Steve, what's the average length for vetting, and why are we getting such long delays? For people who are volunteering their own time, they don't get paid for this.
Yeah, I don't have detail of the average length of time. Clearly that situation's horrendous and not something to be proud of. The situation we have is driven from is a result of good news, which is because we are recruiting so fast, and we're recruiting almost double at the rate we were a few years ago. That's police officers, and I mentioned already that we're looking to increase staff in detention, staff in control rooms, analyst numbers are going up, so we are generally increasing the number of all of our people. They all require vetting. The priority for vetting goes to police officers, new recruits, and I'm afraid there is a pecking order for this, and custody volunteers are further down the pecking order, so it's taking a long time to get them vetted. We're also, without getting too complex, we're increasing the number of vetting staff by recruiting them to increase the number so we can improve our vetting timescales, because we know it's a problem for a number of different specialisms within the organisation. But that's the root cause. I can get you some figures in due course on how long it takes on average.
I think that would be helpful, because in Barnet, for example, now there are visits only on a fortnightly basis. Before it was weekly, because there's simply not enough people to do it. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how often security passes have to be reissued. I think it's either 5 years or 10 years. But is it possible in those circumstances for passes to be continued, effectively extended, until the vetting has happened? Because that would be a way of getting around that particular problem. Somebody said, okay, I'm applying to have it renewed, will you extend my existing one until the vetting is completed?
So here and now, that seems a very sensible idea. My experience is when you talk to the experts in these areas, there are lots of reasons why, oh no, we can't do that, but I can certainly look at other ways of extending people who are applying to have it renewed. Can we extend it until
they're either confirmed or not?
The problem is the pecking order, so we will probably prioritise new custody visitors above vetting these that are looking to renew.
Well, if you do that, that means you're potentially losing the experience.
I appreciate that.
So, I mean, my suggestion is if you allow them to extend, I mean, if it's taking 6 months, it's not such a big deal.
I accept your point.
Until they're vetted. I mean, it'd be interesting to know how many people fail their vetting on renewal, because I suspect it's probably a very small number anyway. And if
it may be a small number, but people's circumstances do change.
Oh, no, I accept that, but if we're looking at a sort of a risk analysis here, if you've got however many is 230 people, or however often they have to renew, and you've only got one or two who are disbarred for some reason or other, it's a relatively low risk. If you're talking about a 6-month extension or something, so perhaps we could know how many people are refused on reapplication as well. That would be helpful.
I think it might be helpful as well in terms, I do discuss vetting with Helen Ball, and it is, as Deputy Commissioner says, there's a big increase in the number of people who need vetting. But in terms of independent custody visitors, there's 18 in the vetting process at the moment. 3 are new and there are 15 renewals. So whilst I do absolutely accept that we've got an issue with a particular constituents in Barnet, we have, you know, over 200 volunteers still working, and but it's 18 that we're talking about that problem, that we have an issue, and they are making their way through vetting.
Yeah, but of course that would be a rolling number. So as other people...
Yeah, but
It'll be a rolling
that's a
number.
snapshot at the moment, is that's the number we're talking about that have got, that are in the vetting process. So it's 18, and we have 200, and nearly 230.
Yeah, I'd say it's a rolling programme.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
you know, you've got 18 now, when they're clear, you'll have
And we do
another
have an
18
issue.
and another
Yeah.
18. So, you know, I think bearing in mind the importance of the role, and people are giving up their
Yeah.
time for
Oh,
free,
absolutely.
you know, I think it's a bit much if we're not respecting that. But more widely on vetting, Steve, I mean, if you're talking about the number of vettings you have to do and how long it takes, is that impacting on recruitment? Because if people have to wait months to be cleared, they may often go off and find another job.
Well, that's why we're fast-tracking the new recruits, because we're very aware that we're in a competitive market. I mean, unemployment rate in London's sort of 2% or lower, so it's a very competitive market. We've opened the recruiting out across the whole of the UK, in fact, the European Union for the time being. So we are prioritising new recruits above all else to try and push them through as fast as we can. It's I know it's an easy thing to say, we could just speed it up. When people have lived abroad for a significant period of time, or actually live in a foreign country, we have to be very careful about the vetting. And there are a number of things we have to look at. So it can take time. But that's what's prioritised, is cops first, and then other people in below that.
No, I mean, I don't think anyone objects to the fact that people have to be vetted and vetted properly. And there will be people who are outliers who are applying from abroad, but a lot of people will be applying from here.
Yeah.
So what's the average time to get a sort of a bog standard vetting through?
I don't have that. I can write to you about all these things. I don't have that detail.
Well, that'd be helpful. And could I just ask, Sophie, while we're on this sort of general subject, about appropriate adult schemes, because we raised this with you before last September, I think. And in April, MOPAC announced that MOPAC and the NHS are going to provide funding to launch an appropriate adult scheme. I'm just wondering where that had got to.
It was an appropriate adult protocol. We received a grant from the NHS, and there's about 40,000 per year for each local authority. You'll know that appropriate adults is not the responsibility of MOPAC to deliver. The local authorities, if they sign up to and meet the key tests, which were part of the decision around being available for both children and adults, and being a member of the National Appropriate Adult Network being a key test, they can apply to apply for some of the funds that are available. I haven't had anything back since April as to how that is going. I'll give it a few months, and we'll assess and look at it after that to see if it has improved the situation.
Well, if we could have an update.
Yeah, very happy
summer.
to, but obviously that was signed on the 16th of April, so it's early days.
So after 3 months.
But it's it's an important step forward. It was the NHS, the Met and MOPAC really trying to make sure there's progress in terms of the provision of appropriate adults.
Because the National Appropriate Adult Network found that across, not just in London, but across England and Wales, there were 100,000 vulnerable adults interviewed without an appropriate adult present, which is just not acceptable.
Absolutely, it is. It would be unacceptable.
Do we have figures of how many were in London?
I don't have those figures, no, not in front of me. We'd have to look at that.
If we could have that as well, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
When you're giving us some of this data on vetting, could you also provide how we compare to other forces? Am I right in thinking that if you have to apply for a DBS certificate, you can apply through any force? Is that right in the country, or do you have to apply through your local force?
Apply anywhere.
Yes, so places like, my memory is that places like Scotland process things a lot faster than the Met Police in this area. And actually, what are they doing that's so different? What resources have they got? Are we looking? Because this has been a problem for several years, and it stops people getting employment, for example, working with children in nurseries and things, working as nannies. It has been an issue. I don't know how we compare to other forces, whether you could perhaps provide that information.
Right, so you're talking about general vetting now. You're not talking about vetting
Wider
for people
vetting,
to join
sorry.
the MPS. Right, okay. I haven't got any information on it. I don't know what the issues is. I mean, it's not been quoted to me as a significant problem recently, and I know it has been in the past. So I need to look at it.
It's all vetting, isn't it? I know it's different levels of vetting, but it's still...
Well, it's not, yeah, I mean, it's very, to come into the police service is very, very different.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
no,
we're
I accept
checking
that.
a wide range of issues in terms of financial background, criminal background, criminal associations.
Yes, I understand that's a
cetera,
different
et cetera.
level. Well, perhaps we could just have the wider as well as the specific for this, I think, because it has been an issue that's come up in the past.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask Deputy Mayor around the issue of independent custody visitors. Obviously, you've closed a number of custody suites in London. There's a huge pool of volunteers there, some of whom are also appropriate adults and do other volunteering roles. What have you done as MOPAC to try to keep those volunteers volunteering in either a similar role at another custody suite or in some of the other roles that there are?
So MOPAC has regular contact with the independent custody visitors and does training for independent custody visitors. As far as I'm aware, the changes to any of the custody suites has not impacted on the number of people who are willing to be custody visitors. I can go back and check whether it has meant that some people have fallen out of being independent custody visitors. We do encourage people as part of the volunteers across the board, not just around ICVs, but safer neighbourhood boards as well. And also within community monitoring groups, but I'm not aware that any of the changes to custody suites has led to people falling out. But I would need to check that. I'd caveat that I haven't.
I just
it's not
think
been raised
not
with
just
me.
whether they fall out, it's what you have done proactively
Yeah.
with these highly skilled volunteers to see if they don't want to. I happen to know someone in Sutton who said, well, I'm not going to travel to Croydon.
Right.
But actually, is there something there that you can link them in with, as you say, safer neighbourhood boards, the panels, or
We'll always be encouraging them. I would have to go back and check what we've done for individuals. I don't have that.
I think that would be useful to understand what that support package is also for ICVs, because I think it's, they're volunteers.
Yeah, no, and really, I think it's really important that we do, just as you have absolutely recognised that ICVs, the independent custody visitors, are volunteers, and we are really grateful and thankful for the work that they do, and they are having an impact. It's, they are carrying out, it's not just the number of custody suites that they are visiting, in terms of the detainees that they talk to and interview. There's nearly 4,000 detainees interviewed by independent custody visitors last year. They have had an impact. They were part of the campaign to ensure that the women who are in custody get the right sanitary protection and the right support around that. Really important work that they've done nationally as well, and the reports that come back, they do have an impact on what happens, and they are looked at by custody sergeants as well. So it is important work that they're doing, and we're very grateful for that.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, can I just mention, just for the accuracy of the minutes, I know you know this, but you said that the Mayor had closed some custody centres. The Mayor didn't close any custody centres. The Commissioner took that decision. So just for accuracy in the minutes.
Okay. Well, they have been closed.
They've been closed,
and
that's because our prisoner arrest rate is 50% less than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, I understand the reason.
Apart from big demonstrations.
There is the occasional blip.
Okay, right. Well, can I thank you both for your attendance today and also for your answers to our questions, and I hope the day goes off peacefully today.
Thank you.
Just a few other items to clear up. Can I now ask the committee to note the discussion and the report from MOPAC attached as Appendix 1 to the report?
Noted.
Thank you. Can I also ask the committee to note a work programme as set out in the report, and note that following discussions with lead group party members, it is proposed to use our meeting slot on the 19th of June for a site visit to support a scrutiny investigation of sexual offences and rape. And can I please ask the committee to delegate authority to me in consultation with party group lead members and Assembly Member Pigeon to agree the arrangements for that site visit?
Agreed.
Thank you. Our next meeting will be a thematic meeting. As we'll be using a thematic meeting slot in June for a site visit, our next meeting will be on Wednesday, the 3rd of July at 10 a.m. And I have no other business. So on that note, no other urgent business. On that note, I'll close the meeting.